Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your invitation. And I don't know if my contribution will be exactly in the focus of your winter school, but I hope at least that it will bring some perspective on the question of experiences of time and our relations to time, and the ways in which also we write history. As soon as time is at issue, we discover that we have access only to experiences of time. When we begin to scrutinize any given culture from this angle, everything, from the most elaborate intellectual production with 1,000 reflective subtleties to the most ordinary everyday object, can offer signs that testify to these experiences. From experiences, we rise to forms and modes of temporality, which are elaborations produced by contemporaries themselves for the sake of orientation in time, their own time, expressions of their need to articulate and reflect it. This is done with the help of words, notions, and concepts. It's accomplished through stories, objects, and images. In short, it calls upon all the resources of culture, past and present. The process of reflecting, articulating, and making use of time unfolds according to the goals people fix and the beliefs they have. The primary, but not the only, reference points are the categories of past, present, and future. What has varied according to time and places is the content and the manner of their articulations, their frontiers. So far, we have no regime of historicity, what I call regime of historicity. That notion, as I have outlined it, intervenes in effect after the fact. It is an artifact and operates in ideal typical mode. What, then, is the fundamental characteristic of the modern regime of historicity? It is, I believe, the predominance of the category of the future, an expanding distance, to adopt the meta-categories of Reinhard Koselleck, an expanding distance between the field of experience and the horizon of expectation. The future is a telos, the aim. It is the source of the light illuminating the past. Time is no longer a simple classificatory principle, but rather an agent, the operator of a historical process, the other name, or rather the true name, for progress. This history, which human beings make, is perceived as accelerating. There is thus a belief in history, a belief that is diffused or reflected, but nonetheless shared. There is also a conviction that mankind makes history. Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, gave the clearest expression of this belief when he wrote in 1840, quote, "When the past no longer illuminates the future, the spirit walks in darkness." With these words, he signaled the end of what I call the old regime of historicity, while at the same time offering a quasi-formulation of the modern regime, that is, a key to comprehending the post-1789 world, in which the future would henceforth illuminate the past. The spirit, thus, does not walk, or no longer walks, in darkness. History becomes a notice addressed by the future to the contemporary and to the past. Had this modern regime survived the 1914-1945 period, which the philosopher Raymond Aron has termed the 30 Years' War, and others, the suicide of Europe. Can we reconcile the idea of progress with the vision of ruins, devastations, the millions of dead, the vanished, the broken generations? To be sure, reconstruction followed on destruction. There was economic progress, gains in productivity, and improvement in the standard of living. Modernization made its demands, and modernity as such was valorized. And this is to say nothing of the setting in of the Cold War and East-West competition after 1945, of the race for arms and progress. But between 1918 and 1945, what does it mean to believe in history? Clearly, we need to distinguish between how the victors and the vanquished experience time, between time as experienced in the new totalitarian regimes and the time experienced in democracies, between the time of the new actors, the United States and the Soviet Union, and that of the old guards. Clearly, the positions, the expectations, and the regrets of these players were not identical any more than the relations formed between past, present, and future could be. Universal time exists, there is no doubt about that, but even aside from our literal experience of jet lag, the time we read is not the same time, not even in Berlin, Moscow, Rome, or Paris. From all of this, the modern regime cannot escape unharmed. This suggests an initial question. Does the notion retain any scrap of relevance when it is asked to embrace experiences of time that are so different, history so shattered, situations so diverse? Or is it simply an empty term subsuming only vague abstractions? That is the question we will set out to answer. As an initial approach, let us look upon time as if it were the ship that served as the emblem of the city of Paris, with its motto, Fluctuat nec mergitur. It pitches, but it does not sink. Before World War I, the notion of time underwent reformulations that render it more capable of surviving through the years to come. For, alongside progress, another figure came to the fore, emerging from time but gaining autonomy, namely revolution, itself conceived as either the spearhead of progress or as beyond progress. At the same time, there came an awareness of the economic dimension of phenomena, the open-eye recognition of a history profoundly marked by modes of production and class struggles, by reflections upon economic crisis. On the heels of this awareness, an economic and social history appeared and gave rise to a new interest in studying the inner, subsurface rhythms of societies. If progress exists, it comes from afar. It's not continuous, and it's not to be confused with what is immediately visible. In brief, the modern regime has now acquired density, profundity. It becomes more complex for the sense of time that defines it no longer as a single coherent flow. Human beings make history. This proposition is the culmination of a long path that had its beginning in the Renaissance with its vision of the human being as agent, as the one who makes and is made. In order to believe in history, it was necessary for time to become, in its turn, an agent. And this development that took place at the end of the 18th century, it is from the meeting and interaction of these two agents, the first of them trying always to master the second, to put it to use, that actual, effective history results. A single example will suffice to give an idea of what might be termed the energetic, optimistic view of the modern regime. Around 1910, the French socialist leader Jean Jaurès, who was, as you know, shot just the day before the beginning of the World War I, Jean Jaurès eloquently expressed his philosophy of time, which addresses both the way in which history is made and the engine that drives political action. In face of his conservative opponents, he claimed true faithfulness to the past. And I quote, "It's by moving toward the sea that the river is faithful to its source." As for history, quote, "It is remarkable to see how the great historical force, that is the French Revolution, that gave rise to a new world, at the same time opened up the way to understanding the old worlds. And as for the present, quote, it's only one moment in the march of humanity. Hence, let there be no blind admiration for it. Since France is moving towards a full clarity it has not yet attained, but which it feels already in thought." And that's one example among many of the same perspective, of the same view. Hence, the future, seen at the deepening and fulfillment of the revolution, is still what animates and gives meaning to both the past and the present. Progress and revolution march together. At the spearhead of progress, the revolution in France is simultaneously behind us because it has taken place and in front of us to be resumed. For some, its defeat means that it awaits completion. It has yet to reach its conclusion, and that's a motto along the 19th century. For others, that defeat has the contrary meaning. It is necessary to start the struggle over again in order to move it to a new level beyond its bourgeois phase. In large measure, the revolution is seen as an occasion for reactivating in a new guise the ancient and powerful Christian temporal schema that straddles the already and the not yet. The revolution has taken place just as the Redeemer has already come, but all has not yet been accomplished. Far from it. Variants will graft themselves onto the schema, differing from it to greater or lesser degrees. Conceived as a logical development, the revolution is sustained and delivered by the future, in accordance with, for example, Lassalle's idea that revolutions make themselves, they are not made. Or with Kautsky, that, quote, we are marching toward an era of revolution whose moment of coming we cannot determine. And there is also a messianist version of it, for example, the version given by Bebel, announcing to his audience in 1891 that, quote, few people present in this hall will fail to experience those days. The Leninist interpretation, however, introduces an altogether new relationship with time. Revolution now arrives through a leap that comes from a place outside the present, enabled by the action of a revolutionary avant-garde. Another time, a new future now opens up, and with it come promise of a complete mastery over destiny. How do French historians position themselves in relation to the futurism of history? Are they its zealous propagators? Less so, it seemed, that we might expect, or at least they are zealous in a way that is more implicit than explicit. Soon designated as positivist by their younger detractors, the experience they look back to are the defeat of 1870, again the Prussia, and the Commune, the founding of the Republic, and the Dreyfus affair. The more they lay claim to pursue a scientific history, the more they emphasize the past and to insist on the necessity of splitting the past from the present. The only scientific history, they declare, is the history of the past. The historian must, in a certain sense, separate himself from himself, that's to say, abstract himself from the present. Lucien Febvre, the founder of the Annales, does not fail to underscore that in fact, this history, quote, was nothing but a deification of the present with the help of the past, but that it refused to see or express this fact. In sum, the past here tends to prevail over the future. If intelligibility still comes from the future, one simply does not make too big a deal out of it, or rather, one proceeds as if the past were speaking all by itself. The Republic being conceived of as the definitive regime. But then, the crisis of the Dreyfus affair comes along, and by deeply dividing historians, remind them that even if the critical method does not offer a solution to everything, it can still lead them to leave their offices to confront the challenges posed by the present. The Dreyfus affair, in effect, plays a role in the emergence of a contemporary history, the possibility of doing a contemporary history, of practicing contemporary history. But the Great War catalyzes one of those periods of pause that Hannah Arendt termed time gaps, bringing with it many profound questioning of the relation of man to time. What's most important, what becomes of the common belief in history? Starting in 1919, the poet and thinker Paul Valéry responds with his famous prosopopoeia on Europe's decadence, which soon becomes famous. We, the civilization, we know now we are mortal. We now see that the abyss of history is large enough for the whole world. As a result of this collapse, it's as difficult to reconstitute the past as to construct the future. And Valéry said, the prophet is in the same bag as the historian. Let's leave them there. History has gone bankrupt. Gone is a diplomatic history a la Bismarck, the only history Valéry knew, one that claimed foresight, but is founded on precedent and prides itself on lessons taught, a history that formulates a tomorrow, but not at all a tomorrow that has never presented itself. Alongside with what Valéry analyzed as the crisis of the spirit, we have what in Germany was termed a crisis of historicism, a complex cultural phenomenon that preceded the war, but was also precipitated by it, and which had multiple expressions. In regards to temporalities, its best-known expression has become Walter Benjamin's critique of a homogeneous, linear, and empty time, and is an evocation of a messianic time, the appeal to another historical time, that of a dazzling conjunction between present and past moments, also represents a new phase in another form of history, inviting us to tie the present and the past together in a different way, while at the same time not renouncing the idea of revolution. In this constellation, the future, but a transfigured future, remains the guiding category. The strength of the idea of revolution is also attested to, albeit in a reversed sense, by the oxymoron of the conservative revolution, forged in those years, a singularity of the Weimar epoch, involving nothing less than a mobilization of the then current power of that idea to freely recreate a past that never existed. Against the tyranny of the future and its misdeeds, we turn to the past and its blessings by means of a double radicalization that is both backward and forward looking. Another critique, or at least form of dissatisfaction with modern time, is expressed by a new place being recognized for memory as being either outside history or as having a critical relationship with it. Alongside Proust, Bergson, and again Benjamin and his concept of Eingedanken, there is the sociology of memory developed by Maurice Halbwachs between 1920 and his death in 1944 as a consequence of this sociology of memory, as a consequence of the Great War, but without ever referring to it. For Alvax, all collective memory as, quote, a group limited in space and time as its support. Since every group has its own duration, there is no single universal time. Seen from the point of view of memory, history can only be in a position of exteriority. Indeed, its practitioners have established that history began where memory ended. That was the position of the historian at that time. Alvax says no more than that, but he insists on the hiatus that separates the two. Collective memory concerns itself with resemblances. History, proceeding by shortcuts that evade continuity, underscore differences. It, I quote, history extracts the changes from within duration. Memory, on the contrary, is located in the continuous. After crisis, memory works as restoring the thread of continuity. And even if, quote, the illusion does not last, for some time at least, we figure that nothing has changed. From the University of Strasbourg, once again French after the Great War, we have finally the historian's professional response, that of the founders of the periodical Les Annales. Their key aim is to break with the instrumentalization to which history had been subjected in the two camps for the sake of aiming at, quote, truly disinterested analytic effort, end of quote. That is Lucien Febvre's first answer, ethical and methodological at once, asking himself aloud in 1919 whether he has the right to practice history in a world in ruins. At the same time, stimulated by the young discipline of sociology and economic and social history, has begun to claim its place, a history attentive to other ways of measuring temporality. In 1929, in their address aux lecteurs, Bloch and Febvre announced their desire to fight against the divorce between historians who apply their good old methods to documents from the past and other researchers who, quote, engage in the study of contemporary societies and economies. Hence, without denying the importance of specialization, we need to favor a movement back and forth between past and present. The future, they said, of economic history is at that cost, and also a proper understanding of the facts that will be history tomorrow, while recognizing that what is closest is not necessarily what offers the best explanations. The main combat, the main fight, is always against the past-present division, that credo of methodological history. But there is no longer any pretense, as there was with the founder of the Revue Historique in 1876, that the historian was to contribute, quote, to the greatness of the homeland and progress of the human race. In short, the future seems to have declined as a force, at least in the realm of historical scholarship. It may remain a value for the citizen, but the historian does not base his reflection on it or make of it the principle for understanding history. Work is now centered on rendering the border between past and present permeable while recognizing the presence of the historian in history. Raymond Aron, I quote already, attitude is also revealing. In 1938, he publishes his introduction to the philosophy of history, which contains a ferocious critique of positivist history, questioning, if not the reality, then at least the regularity of progress. Importantly, thanks to his experience in Germany, where he spent several years, he is familiar with historicism and the crisis it is undergoing. For Aron, historicism is a philosophy of relativism. It corresponds to, quote, a period unsure of itself, to a society with no future, and it expresses itself as a substitution of the myth of becoming for the myth of progress, end of quote. And in place of the optimistic certainty that the future will be better than the present, a sort of pessimism or agnosticism spreads itself out. And against such fatalism, Aron defends the idea that, quote, the past depends on knowledge and the future on will. The latter is not to be observed, but to be created. And 2 years later, in 1940, with the war, Aron will leave for London to join the General de Gaulle. For him, too, the historian is present in history, and there can be no doubt that there is a history, often tragic, and choices to be made. The human being has a history, or better is, I quote, an unfinished history. Fatalism, I think, is merely the symmetrical inverse of the optimism of the future characteristic of the modern regime. The sign inverts itself, but the structure remains. A few words about what happens after the Second World War. How is one to regard the incompletion of this history after 1945? In face of the breadth and continuing vitality of this question, I will limit myself to a few remarks. What becomes of the belief in history and in time as progress? There is, to begin with, a strong awareness that a gap has opened up in time. In the world of yesterday, written before his suicide in Brazil in 1942, Stefan Zweig bears witness to the disruption, quote, between our today, our yesterday, our day before yesterday, all the bridges have been broken. Or, as the poet René Char puts it, trying in 1946 to express his experience of the resistance, that's a famous phrase, our heritage was left to us by no testament. Hannah Arendt would take up these words, since for her, the aphorism grasps through its abrupt side the moment where a gap opens up between the past and the future, a strange intervening space where agents, quote Hannah Arendt, become aware of an interval in time altogether determined by things that are no more and by things that are not yet. Indicating to the heir what will legitimately be his, the testament is in effect an operation on time. It, says Arendt, it assigns a past to the future. It names, tells where the treasure is and what it contains. The simple fluke of becoming becomes continuous time, measured between past and future. In the literal sense, testament makes itself tradition. Here, Tocqueville's formula about the past no longer eliminating the future readily comes to mind. Could light still come from the future? Could it do so for the historians, for those who, as we have seen, had already long before taken their distance from the optimistic version of historicity? Interesting in this respect are the positions of two historians who will become very close during the post-war period. Lucien Febvre, I already mentioned him, and Fernand Braudel. In 1946, Febvre launches what he called the Manifest of the New Annals, with a very clear title, Facing the Wind. And the new subtitle of the periodical is Economy, Societies, Civilizations. In there, Febvre underscores that we have henceforth entered a new world. One, he said, in a state of definitive instability, where the ruins are immense, but where there is also, quote, something quite different than ruins and more serious, that prodigious acceleration of speed, which, telescoping the continents, abolishing the oceans, suppressing the deserts, places human groups charged with opposing electricity in abrupt contact. The urgency, and it's always fair speaking, the urgency at the risk of no longer understanding the globalized world of tomorrow, of today already, is thus not to look back at what had just taken place, but forward, in front of oneself, facing the wind. Finish, he said again, finish is the world of yesterday, finished forever. If we have a chance to pull through, it will be in understanding more quickly and better than others this manifest truth, in leaving the shipwreck into the water, I tell you, and swim steadily. To explain the world to the world, to answer the questions posed by mankind today, such is the historian's task when facing the wind. As for the past, the only task is to understand well how it differs from the present. 3 years later, in an article significantly titled Towards Another History, an article of Lucien Febvre, which constitutes a sort of passing of the baton between him and Braudel, Febvre reiterates the necessity for an opening up towards the world and the future, pleading for a history that does not allow the past to crush us, but rather organize it to, I quote, to prevent it from weighing too much on the shoulders of the living. Forgetting is a necessity for groups, for societies that want to live. End of quote. The future is here. It's knocking at the window. Facing it requires a survival operation, which is also the only way to undo or re-undo the practice of history with meaning. In the same year, 1949, Braudel publishes his Mediterranean and the Mediterranean world. Prepared over a long period before the war, then taken up again during his years as a war prisoner, this manifesto for what he called a structural history finally appears in 1949. Braudel does not comment directly on either the recent period or the future power to sweep things along, but it is well known that the author, as he said, little interest in events, and that among the three forms of temporality, the main role is given to what he called the longue durée, the long duration, to those layers of slow history located where there is barely any movement. To Treitschke, the German historian Treitschke, to Treitschke prideful unilateral declaration, human beings make history, Braudel thus counters that, quote, history also makes human beings and shapes their destiny, and by the same token limits their responsibility. They have little control over history's course. If Febvre and Braudel start from different views of what constitutes the time of history, they agree in avoiding the recent past and share the idea that a new world needs a new history, the history of civilization for Febvre, that of the longue durée for Braudel, whence the natural emergence of another idea, the long duration of civilizations. For his part, in Race and History, Race et Histoire, published in 1952, Claude Lévi-Strauss likewise starts with civilizations, which for him need to be seen as spread out, not so much in time as in space. Challenging evolutionism, he asks us to shift from seeing progress as the universal category to seeing it merely as the category of, quote, particular mode of existence proper to our society, end of quote. Which each new publication, Lévi-Strauss then strongly calls into question the modern regime of historicity. Similar is his distinction, the first of which he always emphasizes is theoretical, between hot and cold societies. If the former have been shaped by a futurist temporalization of history and have even made it into a principle of development, such is not the case with the latter, or not yet, or only to a certain extent, the one certain thing being that all of these societies, hot or cold, are both located in history and producers of history, with, however, different modalities of being in time. This is a way of revisiting or nuancing relativism. Nevertheless, in those years, progress and history run their course, even a hellish one. In the press, Hiroshima, the nuclear bomb, Hiroshima is initially presented as a technical achievement. The revolution is there as a threat or a promise, but in any event victorious. The war's victors make history and divide up the world. Reconstruction, modernization, the planned economy are so many watchwords giving the main role to the future. Various slogans indicate that the nations have begun their forward march again. You have the radiant future, the German miracle, or the 30 glorious years, referring to the post-war economic boom, which already a retrospective undertone. All of this is orchestrated by the Cold War, the nuclear threat, and the forward rush it renders imperative for both camps. This is one of the phases of progress. Another will soon be the birth of the consumer society. There is thus a divergence between the form of temporality envisaged by the social sciences and the time of society, even if that word is too generic. The gap, which is not new, will even continue to expand until the end of the 1960s. The structuralist fever here comes to mind. 1968, in this respect, can be viewed as a signal. The futurist basis in any event remains, implicitly in the social science, explicitly for social time. But when the revolution vanishes from the horizon in the 1970s, futurism recedes, and the present, in the space that has been let free, and the present gradually imposes itself as the dominant category. Thank you.